Hello and welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, a 16-year-old Israeli boy murdered and over 20 other Israelis injured in Jerusalem by a coordinated double-bombing terror attack. Meantime, Palestinian terrorists breaking into a hospital in Jenin to kill and kidnap an Israeli Druze high schooler. And with attacks targeting Jews and Israelis worldwide, an American nonprofit trying to shore up the gaps in security. Two explosions at separate Jerusalem bus stops, rocking the Israeli capital this morning and causing serious injuries and at least one death. The murdered victim, later confirmed as 16-year-old Israeli-Canadian citizen Aryeh Tzupak, a yeshiva student from Jerusalem's Har Nof neighborhood. Meantime, the blasts caused by bombs planted by terrorists and detonated remotely. There were no immediate claims of responsibility, but following the blasts, security services sweeping the areas in attempts to find any suspects connected to the attacks. ILTV's Steve Leibowitz reporting.
The first explosion was in the Givat Shaul neighborhood close to the main entrance to Jerusalem at about 7 in the morning. 11 people were injured in the blast, including 2 critically. The victims were taken to Hadassah Ein Kerem and Shaarei Tzedek hospitals, where one died of his injuries. The second blast was near the remote junction. 3 people were injured by shrapnel. There were no immediate claims of responsibility. Following the blasts, security forces swept the area in an attempt to find any suspects connected to the attacks. It was determined that the blasts were detonated remotely.
בוקר לא פשוט מבחינת כמות הנפגעים. יש לנו פה מתווה של פיגוע שהרבה שנים לא ראינו כמותו, כלומר 2 פיגועים ברצף. אנחנו לא יודעים כרגע להגיד אם מדובר במפגע אחד או בחוליה מפוצלת. בכל מקרה, כרגע עיקר המאמץ של משטרת ישראל כרגע הוא סריקות בכל האזורים שמועדים לפורענות, אם זה בתחנות אוטובוס, תחנות הסעה, באוטובוסים במקומות ריכוזי קהל, במקביל למאמץ של המרדף ולשים את היד אחר מבצע הפיגוע. אנחנו נעשה כל שביכולתנו ביחד עם כל גורמי הביטחון האחרים ונגיע לחוליה הזאת.
The police will ratchet up security all around Jerusalem, and they're also emphasizing that this is different than any attacks in the recent past, and they're calling on the public to be especially vigilant when they see suspicious packages. The explosions came amid heightened tensions following a series of Palestinian terror attacks, which have left 29 people dead in Israel and Judea and Samaria. In recent months, there have been a number of stabbing attacks in Jerusalem, including the killing of a female soldier at a checkpoint. In the spring, the army launched a major anti-terror attack that is ongoing. More than 2,000 Palestinians have been arrested in the near-nightly raids that have left 130 Palestinians dead, mostly killed in clashes with soldiers. Bombings in Jerusalem were commonplace during the Second Intifada between the year 2000 and 2005. There have been very few buses targeted over the past 17 years. This is primarily attributed to increased security measures, including the creation of a security barrier between Israel and the Palestinian territories. The previous major bus attack was in 2016, in a Hamas attack that injured 21. The last death before today was in 2011, when 2 were killed and a dozen injured.
With more on this morning's horrendous terror attacks, Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, Flo Hassan Nahum. Flo, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Well, it's a very sad day. You wake up to the news that innocent people waiting for a bus, going about their daily lives, have been attacked, 1 killed, multiple attacks. It reminds me of the time that I moved to Israel in 2001, the Second Intifada, when we had these stories once a week, and I pray that we're not in that situation again.
What's happening in the streets of Jerusalem after an attack like this? Because after smaller attacks, for example, even life typically resumes after a relatively short while, which is a harsh reality here in Israel, but that's the truth. Is this different?
Well, I was at the site only a few hours ago, and there were still security forces there looking for clues, finding evidence. But life was beginning to get back to normal. the bus stop, which is right where the attack occurred, was beginning to have buses come pick people up. That is the tragedy and the beauty of Israel is that our resilience makes us move on quite quickly whilst we remember the victims of this terror attack. And of course, we pray for the full recovery of the injured. But life is going on. We have our educational department in the city of Jerusalem speaking to school kids about situations that can arise with post-trauma. It's important to talk about these things so that children are not scared to go out into the streets. And that's what the city of Jerusalem is best equipped to deal with.
Is there any talk to these students about also being vigilant in terms of keeping an eye out for potential attacks in the future? We've heard from previous reports that some of the victims reported seeing an individual taking pictures of people at the bus stop shortly before the attack, for example.
I think it's very important that we always remain vigilant. And, in the world that we live in, that we're all kind of stuck as zombies sometimes on our phones, especially when we're waiting for a bus or even when we're walking. I think that actually is very dangerous. We have to always be aware of our surroundings and notice when something is off or there's a package that shouldn't be there. I think that this world that we live in now, which is different to the world that I came into 21 years ago when I moved here during the Second Intifada, is that we're all much more, living in our own bubbles, our own internet bubbles of our phones. And I think we need to be very, very cognizant that when we're in a public place, we should step out of that, look around and be aware of what's around us.
All right, now moving on to likely incoming Public Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. He's calling for a much harsher response to terror in order to create a deterrent, including targeted assassinations, closing down the prisons and ending visitors' rights for convicted terrorists, and quote-unquote laying siege to them by going door to door in search of weapons and suspects. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, Itamar Ben-Gvir was elected with such popularity, mainly because he was the only person in the last election talking about internal security. And this was really the zeitgeist that got him all the seats that he won. And so if he is to become public security minister, I'm not sure which measures he will be able to implement or not. But the situation, I think, is much more complicated than closing down a few jails. And normally, I don't believe that these measures are particularly effective. I think what we need to do, in fact, is to deal with the conditions of terrorism, the conditions in which terrorism are allowed to flourish. And in my eyes, there's two main conditions. One is the pay-to-slay policy by the Palestinian Authority. Many people don't know that anybody who kills a Jew gets $3,000 a month pension for life. And if you kill more than one Jew, it goes up, of course. And the second thing is the Palestinian school book, which is funded by UNRWA, a UN body, and a lot of countries around the world. And this is a curriculum that teaches small children to hate, teaches them glorification of martyrs, teaches them that Israel will not exist if we keep resisting. And so instead of trying to put a plaster on the situation, we should really deal with the root causes of terrorism.
All right, Flora Sanachum, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you.
Now, in a separate, extremely serious terrorist incident overnight Wednesday, the body of a Druze Israeli teenager abducted by some 30 Palestinian gunmen from a hospital in Judea and Samaria. The teen's uncle saying he witnessed the kidnapping in real time. 18-year-old Tiran Ferro from the Daliat al-Carmel area, as well as another Israeli citizen, gravely injured in a car crash near the American University in Jenin Tuesday evening, and the two placed on life support in Jenin's Ibn Sina hospital. But shortly after their admittance, dozens of armed Palestinians thought to be affiliated with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad terror group entering the room, removing Ferro from life support, effectively killing him, and then kidnapping his body. Ferro's uncle insisting that Tiran was alive until the abduction. As for the reason, initial reports saying that the gunman believed Ferro to be a soldier despite his being a 12th grade student. And Palestinian officials now saying that the suspects are demanding the release of imprisoned Palestinian terrorists in exchange for Ferro's body. Israel, meantime, in attempts to pressure the group into returning the body, closing all the border crossings around the Jenin area, and Ferro's injured friend transferred by the IDF to a hospital in Israel proper before anything else could happen. Palestinian terrorists often work to kidnap Israeli citizens to be used as bargaining chips against Jerusalem. Most famously, Hamas kidnapping IDF soldier Gilad Shalit and exchanging him in 2011 after over 5 years in captivity for over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners convicted on terror-related charges, many of whom have gone on to reoffend. In fact, one of the released prisoners being Yihya Sinwar, today the political head of the Hamas terror group in Gaza. And currently, to this day, Hamas is also holding on to 4 Israeli citizens for the same purposes. The bodies of IDF soldiers Hadar Golden and Oron Shaul, killed and kidnapped by Hamas after a ceasefire was in effect, held for over 8 years. The families denied burial rights. And then Hisham El-Sayed and Avera Mengistu, 2 Israeli civilians who suffer from mental illness, held alive in Hamas's captivity since 2014 and 2015. The demands for their release far higher than those agreed to in the Gilad Shalit exchange. Now, with more on Israel's evolving security policy, particularly as coalition negotiations are continuing, Executive Director of Honest Reporting and former J-Post political analyst, Gil Hoffman. Gil, thank you so much for being with us. Now, several incoming coalition Knesset members are saying that we need to form a government as quickly as possible because the terror will not wait. Is Israel at a particularly high risk given the interim government's handoff to the new coalition, or is this attack unrelated?
Aaron, Israel's enemies will always try to attack the Jewish state, and there will always be attempts at terrorist attacks. Today, unfortunately, the attacks succeeded, and a young man lost his life, possibly more. And it doesn't really matter who's in power. However, there is no doubt that terrorist groups have tried to test Israel when there have been times of transition before. When there have been leaders that didn't have security experience before, and this time is indeed particularly sensitive.
All right, well, left-wing NGO Darkenu, meantime, is calling such comments from the politicians disgraceful. They're saying that the MKs are dancing on the blood of the victims in order to improve their positions in negotiations. What are your thoughts?
Look, there will always be attempts by politicians to take advantage of terrorist attacks. Whether that is their main goal or not is in the eye of the beholder. Netanyahu always made sure to use his security credentials to advance himself politically. Over the last year and a half, we saw how Itamar Ben-Gvir came to every single terrorist attack site and made sure to be on camera. Here he came as the internal security minister designate, and they claimed to have been briefed by the army police inspector general, which wasn't exactly true. It's changing now. We're going to see how a right-wing government handles the attacks differently. Yair Lapid made a point of briefing Netanyahu immediately today, and that was a professional, apolitical thing to do.
All right, now several MKs from Otzma Yehudit under Itamar Ben-Gvir to the Likud under Netanyahu are saying that Israel needs to have a strong nationalist government to break the chain of recent violence. But other analysts are actually warning that the Palestinians might push harder because of the perceived threat from such a national government. Is there anything to know before we see it? Is there any way to know before we see it, or what can we expect?
There will be very soon a right-wing government where you have people in power who are very right-wing who will be tested. And there's already been a party to the right of Otzma Yehudit, of Ben-Gvir's party, formed that's going to say every time he's not being tough enough. It happened to so many politicians that were perceived as right-wing before, whether it was Netanyahu or Naftali Bennett or Ariel Sharon. And now it's going to happen to Ben-Gvir too. This is going to be their test. And they have to also get along. because you've got different right-wing parties that compete with each other who are going to be part of the government. And are they going to be handling this cohesively as one body, or are they going to be attacking each other with the Ben Gvir controlling the police and the Likud controlling the military, one accusing the other, and it really being the prime minister in charge? We'll see what'll happen. It'll be really interesting.
Would you care to hazard a guess as to what their cooperation might actually look like based on today?
Political infighting and chaos. They're going to attack each other. It's going to be really fun.
All right, Religious Zionism Party officials are saying that talks are back to square one. What exactly do you think that they mean by that?
Well, already last night, there were statements put out by Smotrich's Religious Zionist Party that the Likud had gone back from previous promises. The Likud countered by saying that that Smotrich's party had asked for new demands that it hadn't asked for before. And then today, there were more back and forth accusations. This is not how a government is formed. Ben Gvir said at the site of the attack that because of the attack, a government has to be formed as soon as possible. Smotrich tweeted it. I don't see a government being formed this week. At best, maybe they'd get their act together over the weekend and submit it as required 2 days in advance. On Monday, at best, we can have a government a week from today.
All right, Gil Hoffman, thank you so much for your time.
Always a pleasure.
Moving on, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps is now reissuing threats against Israel after claiming that Iranian Colonel Davoud Jafari was killed by an alleged Israeli strike in Syria. An explosive device said to have hit Jafari's vehicle on the road near the area of Damascus. Jafari was an advisor from the IRGC's Aerospace Division, the IRGC being an internationally recognized terror organization. Now, in spite of Iran's insistence that, quote, Israel is responsible for the criminal assassination, and, quote, evidence has not yet been provided. That said, Israel has conducted many strikes against Iranian and pro-Iran regime forces in Syria and Lebanon over the years. Officials from Jerusalem repeatedly stating that they will not tolerate Tehran's entrenchment across the Middle East, designed to destabilize the region and attack Israel. And indeed, Israel has even admitted to carrying out hundreds of strikes on Iran-affiliated targets in the past, including weapons shipments to terror groups like Hezbollah, arms manufacturing sites, and other similar military bases. Now, with extremist attacks targeting Israelis and Jews, not just in Jerusalem, but all over the world, the Jewish community is increasingly taking it upon itself to thwart threats, particularly in the United States, where Jews are targeted more than any other group, despite making up less than 3% of the population. Joining me with more, Richard Priam, COO of the nonprofit Community Security Service. Richard, thank you so much for joining us. Now, what can you tell me about the CSS? How does it work, and how did it start?
First of all, thank you for having me on today. And to summarize in a nutshell what it is that CSS does is we train members of the community, of the Jewish community in the United States, to be involved with their own security, to identify suspicious indicators, to understand basic security procedures, to be involved with the security of their synagogues and their Jewish events. And to date, we have trained over 6,000 Jewish community members from coast to coast across the United States. And every week, our volunteers are helping protecting their institutions, their events, keeping our community safe.
So, you mentioned, of course, that you're from coast to coast. Where specifically maybe does CSS operate, and from where do you get your volunteers?
So we get our volunteers from the synagogues and the Jewish institutions we protect themselves. And the concept is quite simple. Nobody's going to care more than the safety of the people inside the synagogue when those people inside are your friends, your family, your children. So the volunteers in our network are Jewish community members involved in Jewish life, involved with their congregations. And while we were originally founded on the East Coast in Manhattan, and we still have our largest presence in the tri-state area, we have since expanded to have a presence from Seattle to San Diego to Florida. And we continue to grow. We continue to expand for the very simple reason that the threat is increasing. The threat is not going away. According to the FBI, 63% of all religiously motivated hate crimes targeted the Jewish community. As you mentioned, a very small minority in the United States. And we also see an increase in serious attacks. Jersey City, Muncie, Poway. Colleyville, you name it. So we have to take security seriously. And the one good thing, the silver lining in this situation is that the community is stepping up and taking those threats more seriously as well.
What kind of training do you provide to your volunteers, and what kind of continuing support does CSS provide?
So obviously we don't disclose all the operational procedures that we teach, but the bottom line of it is this. Attacks in the diaspora don't happen in a vacuum, whether it is Europe or the United States, and even in some cases in Israel, pre-attack indicators are identifiable. People want to find out what should be their target, which synagogue should they perpetrate their attack on, which place has the least amount of security. And when they're doing that kind of research, whether it's online or in person, that gives us, people working in Jewish security, an opportunity to identify those pre-attack indicators. So we can train volunteers, not only to create a posture around their institution, to have that deterrence that makes anyone who seeks to do harm to the community think twice about targeting that institution, but we can also train them to identify proactively when somebody might be seeking harm and get that information to us, to law enforcement, to help make preventative arrests. And we've seen more and more cases over the last 2 years where our volunteers have made that difference. Just last week, on Friday, through our research department, we learned from our friends in the United Kingdom that there was somebody in the United States making threats against the Jewish community. We shared that with law enforcement, and a few hours later, someone on Penn Station, together with someone else, was arrested with a firearm, knife, and a swastika.
Wow, that's incredible work. Richard, thank you so much for telling us a little bit about that, and thank you for the work that CSS is doing in the United States and abroad.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Yes.
Turning now to the World Cup in Dubai, where Israeli media covering the event are being well treated by authorities, but not so much by some of the Arab fans in attendance. ILTV's Steve Leibowitz reporting.
Israeli media covering the World Cup in Qatar have had mixed experiences with spectators from around the world. Israelis are not generally allowed in Doha because the countries lack bilateral relations, but the World Soccer Championship required that Israelis, including the media, be allowed to attend.
بصراحة الاستقبال اللي توجهنا هان كان كتير مليح. شكله إنه دولة قطر فتحت إيديها أمام كل العالم، وبما في ذلك نحن الإسرائيليين وخاصة الصحفيين الإسرائيليين. بس في مشكلة، والمشكلة مش القطريين، المشكلة الثانيين العرب. وعادة لما بشوف عرب هان من بلدان زي السعودية أو حتى تونسيا وشغلات زي هاد، شكله إنه عنده مشكلة كبيرة معنا. وبصراحة أنا مش فاهم إيش القصة.
Some in the media have made their Israeliness part of the story to test whether Arab and Iranian fans are comfortable speaking to them. The results have not always been positive.
مرحبا، أهلا، شو أخبارك؟ الحمد لله. أنت من لبنان؟ إيه. أنا من إسرائيل يا أخي. أنت من إسرائيل؟ أنت وصلت لعندي. أنت شو جايب؟ أنت إجت لهان. الله فلسطين. ما في إسرائيل؟ في إسرائيل يا سيدي، في إسرائيل.
وين أنت من وين؟
أنا من إسرائيل.
فلسطين. فلسطين. مش إسرائيل.
أنت بتقول فلسطين، أنا بقول إسرائيل.
لا فلسطين. إسرائيل مش موجودة.
يعطيك العافية.
Tunisians made a point of demonstrating their political viewpoint.
ما نتكلم مع القنوات الإسرائيلية يعني ما فيش دولة اسمها إسرائيل، بس فلسطين. يعني إذا تكون قناة فلسطينية أي قناة عربية نتكلم، قناة إسرائيلية ما راح نتكلم. يعني ما نستعرف دولة اسمها إسرائيل، ما فيش دولة اسمها إسرائيل، بس فلسطين. تحيا فلسطين.
Following the Abraham Accords, many in Israel were hopeful of a warming of relations with the Arab world. Based on this sample, it could be a long way to go.
Let's take a look now at the weather forecast. Tonight, you can expect clear skies and a drop in temperatures with an average low of about 13 degrees Celsius or 56 Fahrenheit. And tomorrow, seeing wetter weather with rain and thunderstorms across various regions and top temperatures reaching a cooler 21 Celsius or 70 degrees Fahrenheit. That's all for today's news. For more updates from Israel on all of your devices, check out our ILTV channels on YouTube, Facebook, and on Telegram, and subscribe to our ILTV newsletter. I'm Aaron Porras. Be well, and thank you so much for watching.